At the airport security checkpoint, the police surrounded my wife and me. "Who owns this luggage?" they asked. My wife pointed at me and said, "It's his," with a smirk. The police opened the bag. Their faces turned pale, and they said, "You know what's absolutely hilarious about airports? They're like human aquariums, except instead of pretty fish, you've got Karen from accounting arguing with a gate agent about her emotional support peacock, and Brad from finance sweating through his polo shirt because he forgot to take his vape out of his carry-on. Half the people wandering around look like they just won the lottery and are heading to their dream vacation in Cabo, while the other half look like they're being shipped off to federal prison. Me? I just wanted to navigate this bureaucratic nightmare without my belt ending up in one of those gray plastic trays, making me do the awkward shuffle walk through security while trying to keep my pants from becoming a public embarrassment. The fluorescent lights in this place were doing absolutely no favors for anyone. Seriously, whoever designed airport lighting clearly had a personal vendetta against humanity. Under these soul-crushing bulbs, everyone looked guilty of something. Even the toddlers in their tiny sneakers and juice-stained shirts looked like they were plotting something sinister. Maybe it was just me being paranoid, but when your wife's been acting shadier than a used car salesman for the past few weeks, you start seeing conspiracies everywhere. Clara walked ahead of me, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with that confident rhythm she'd perfected over our 10 years of marriage. Every few steps, her manicured hand would brush against my arm in what used to be her signature move, that casual, affectionate touch that once made me feel like the luckiest guy in the terminal. Back when she was still the sweet, genuine woman I fell head over heels for at that college coffee shop, the one who laughed at my terrible jokes and actually meant it. Spoiler alert, she wasn't that woman anymore. These days, her touches felt more like a spider checking if its prey was still alive. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself here. At that moment, walking through the airport with our matching black suitcases rolling behind us, we probably looked like any other married couple heading off on a romantic getaway. Just your average suburban couple, ready to sip piña coladas and pretend their marriage wasn't slowly imploding like a controlled demolition. I was actually starting to think we might make it through this whole ordeal without any drama. Maybe grab some overpriced airport coffee, complain about the delayed flight, and settle into our seats like civilized adults. Maybe Clara would even put down her phone long enough to have an actual conversation instead of typing mysterious messages to whoever had been occupying so much of her attention lately. Then bam! For officers in those unmistakable blue jackets materialized out of nowhere like they'd been waiting in the wings for their big dramatic entrance. "This wasn't your run-of-the-mill, 'Excuse me, sir, can I see your boarding pass and ID' situation. Oh no, this was full-blown, 'We've already got your mugshot printed and your cell picked out' energy." These guys had the kind of serious expressions that made you instantly start mentally reviewing every questionable thing you'd done in the past decade, even if it was just jaywalking or keeping that extra ketchup packet from McDonald's. The lead officer, a stocky guy with the kind of mustache that screamed, "I peaked in high school football," stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. His badge read Sergeant O'Donnell, and he had the dead-eyed stare of a man who'd seen every excuse, every sob story, and every "this isn't mine" officer performance in the book. "Folks, we're going to need you to come with us," he said, his voice carrying that special blend of authority and boredom that only comes with years of dealing with airport security situations. It wasn't a request. It was one of those polite commands that sounds friendly enough until you realize refusing isn't really an option. My stomach dropped faster than a lead balloon. Clara's grip on my arm tightened, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve. For a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Was it fear? Panic? Or was she just annoyed that her carefully laid plans were hitting a speed bump? "Is there a problem, officers?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady and doing my absolute best impression of an innocent traveler who definitely didn't have any reason to be nervous about law enforcement suddenly taking an interest in his travel plans. Sergeant O'Donnell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for us to follow him, and suddenly we were being escorted away from the main terminal like celebrities with a really terrible PR team. Other passengers gawked at us as we passed, probably wondering what kind of drama they were witnessing. Some pulled out their phones, because apparently nothing says great vacation content like filming strangers getting hauled away by airport security. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice how Clara's confident stride had shifted into something more uncertain. Her heels still clicked against the floor, but the rhythm was off now, less self-assured and more like she was buying time to think. Which was interesting, because if this was just some random security check or mistaken identity situation, why would she need to think about anything at all? The officers led us down a corridor that looked like it had been designed by someone with absolutely no imagination and a serious grudge against natural light. White walls, no windows, and the kind of institutional carpet that had probably witnessed more confessions than a Catholic church. The air had that recycled, antiseptic smell that made you immediately want to be anywhere else. This was definitely not how I'd pictured our trip starting. They dragged us into what I can only describe as the most depressing room in the history of depressing rooms. Seriously, whoever designed this place clearly studied under the master decorators of Soviet-era interrogation chambers. The walls were that specific shade of institutional white that somehow manages to make you feel guilty even if your biggest crime is forgetting to return a library book. No windows, because apparently natural light might give people hope, and I was pretty sure there was no Wi-Fi either, which in today's world is basically a human rights violation. The whole setup screamed budget crime drama. You know, the kind where they spend all their money on the lead actor and have about $12 left over for set design. There were exactly 4 plastic chairs that looked like they'd been stolen from a high school cafeteria, a metal table that had seen better decades, and fluorescent lights that buzzed with the enthusiasm of a dying bee. If this room had a theme song, it would definitely be played on a kazoo by someone having an existential crisis. Clara and I sat across from each other at that lovely metal table, and let me tell you, the tension in the air was thicker than the mystery meat they serve at airport food courts. She kept glancing around like she was looking for hidden cameras, or maybe planning her escape route. Meanwhile, I was trying to figure out if this was about unpaid parking tickets, or if we'd somehow ended up on a no-fly list because I once gave a bad Yelp review to an airline. Sergeant O'Donnell positioned himself directly across from us with the confidence of a man who'd perfected his "I've seen it all" expression in the mirror. His 3 backup officers spread out around the room like they were guarding Fort Knox, instead of babysitting 2 suburban travelers who probably couldn't successfully smuggle a ham sandwich past a mall security guard. Then came the moment that would forever be etched in my memory as the great suitcase reveal of doom. O'Donnell reached behind him and hefted up a black suitcase that looked suspiciously familiar. Actually, scratch that. It looked exactly like our suitcase. Same brand, same size, same stupid little scratch on the corner that happened when Clara decided to pack like she was moving to Mars, and the thing weighed more than a small car. "All right, folks," he said, placing the suitcase on the table with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for magic shows or courtroom reveals. "Who owns this piece of luggage?" Now, here's where things got interesting. I opened my mouth, ready to do what any normal, innocent husband would do. Claim ownership of our shared luggage and ask what the big deal was. Maybe crack a joke about how my wife's overpacking habits could probably violate several international treaties. You know, typical married couple banter to lighten the mood. But before I could even get out a single syllable, before I could so much as clear my throat or take a breath, Clara's voice cut through the air like a machete through a piñata. "It's his." 2 words. Just 2 simple words, delivered with the kind of cold precision that would make a professional assassin proud. But it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The way her voice dripped with this particular brand of satisfaction, like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact moment to arrive. And that smirk. Oh man, that smirk was a work of art. She didn't just smile. She deployed a full-scale facial expression that had clearly been practiced, perfected, and probably rehearsed in bathroom mirrors across America. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction. This was a performance. She had definitely spent time working on this exact look, probably had a whole montage sequence like she was training for the backstabbing Olympics. The smirk said everything. "Gotcha, sucker. This was always the plan. Hope you like orange jumpsuits. Thanks for playing. Better luck in your next marriage." I sat there staring at her, my brain doing that thing where it completely short-circuits and starts playing that dial-up internet sound from the 90s. Because in that moment, Watching my wife of 10 years throw me under the bus with the enthusiasm of someone winning the lottery, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my marriage had just been flushed down the toilet of reality. The officers exchanged those knowing looks that law enforcement types have perfected, the "yep, another domestic situation gone sideways" expression. Sergeant O'Donnell nodded slowly, like he'd seen this exact scenario play out 100 times before. Probably had a betting pool going with his colleagues about which spouse would crack first. "Sir," he said, turning his attention fully to me while Clara continued to sit there wearing that infuriating smirk like she'd just won a game show. "You're claiming ownership of this suitcase?" Well, I started, but honestly, what was I supposed to say? That yes, it was technically our shared luggage, but whatever was making everyone look like they'd seen a ghost probably wasn't anything I'd packed. That my biggest contribution to our travel gear was usually forgetting to pack enough underwear? O'Donnell didn't wait for my response. With the dramatic timing of someone who clearly enjoyed this part of his job, he unzipped the suitcase. The sound of that zipper was like a countdown to disaster, each tooth revealing whatever fresh hell awaited inside. When the lid finally opened, revealing the contents to everyone in the room, I watched four grown men, trained law enforcement officers who'd probably seen everything from drug busts to weapons smuggling, go completely pale. We're not talking about the "oops, someone forgot to remove their toiletries" kind of pale. This wasn't even the "oh, there's a suspicious-looking electronic device" variety of pale. No, this was the full-scale "congratulations, you've just won a first-class ticket to federal prison" level of color drainage. Their faces went from professional authority to "holy crap, we're going to need more paperwork" faster than you could say constitutional rights. Even Clara's smirk faltered just a tiny bit as she registered their reactions, like maybe she was starting to realize that whatever game she thought she was playing might have stakes higher than she'd originally calculated. And me? I just sat there, still trying to process the fact that my wife had just served me up to airport security like I was the daily special at a restaurant nobody wanted to eat at. So there I was, sitting in this delightful little interrogation room that had all the charm of a dentist's waiting area mixed with a morgue, watching my wife like she was some exotic species I'd never encountered before. You know that feeling when you're watching a nature documentary and the narrator suddenly reveals that what you thought was a harmless butterfly actually feeds on the blood of small mammals? Yeah, that was pretty much my emotional state at that moment. Clara had been acting weird for weeks now, and I don't mean the usual, "honey, do these jeans make me look fat" kind of weird that comes standard with marriage. I'm talking about full-scale, "who are you and what did you do with my wife" levels of bizarre behavior that would make a psychiatrist reach for their notepad and start scribbling furiously. It had started with the midnight phone calls. Now, I've been married long enough to know that when your spouse suddenly starts taking mysterious calls at ungodly hours, whispering into the phone like they're coordinating a military operation, that's generally not a good sign. The first few times it happened, I figured maybe it was her sister going through another one of her dramatic breakups, or her mom calling to complain about the neighbor's dog again. But this was different. These weren't girl talk conversations. These were hushed, urgent exchanges that involved a lot of yes and no responses, with Clara pacing around our bedroom like a caged tiger. When I'd ask her about it the next morning, she'd give me some bullshit story about telemarketers or wrong numbers, delivered with the kind of fake smile you see on politicians during election season. Then there were the passwords. Sweet Jesus, the passwords. This woman suddenly had more security protocols than the Pentagon. Her phone, which used to be as accessible as the TV remote, was now locked down tighter than Fort Knox. She'd changed her passcode from our anniversary date to some cryptic combination that probably required a background in advanced mathematics to crack. Her laptop needed a password. Her tablet needed a password. Hell, I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd started putting passwords on the coffee maker. But the real kicker? The browser history. Clara had discovered the Clear Browsing History button and was using it with the dedication of someone applying for a top-secret clearance with the CIA. Every single day, without fail, that browser would be wiped cleaner than a whistle. Now, I'm not saying I was snooping around. Okay, fine, I was totally snooping around. But when your wife goes from casually leaving her laptop open to treating it like it contains state secrets, a guy starts to wonder what kind of websites require that level of digital sterilization. The whole thing had me feeling like I was living with a stranger who just happened to look exactly like my wife and knew all the right things to say to maintain the illusion. She still made my coffee the way I liked it, still remembered to DVR my shows, still did that little thing where she'd scrunch up her nose when she laughed. But underneath all that familiar behavior, there was something else going on, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first, my brain went to the most obvious explanation. She was having an affair. I mean, it's like marriage problems 101, right? Secretive phone calls, password protection, mysterious behavior. It practically screams, I'm cheating on you with someone who probably drives a motorcycle and has tribal tattoos. And honestly, part of me almost hoped that's all it was. Cheating I could understand. Cheating was straightforward, even if it sucked. It's a tale as old as time. Married couple gets comfortable, someone meets someone else, feelings get complicated, bad decisions are made. Sure, it would hurt like hell and probably involve lawyers and dividing up our collection of kitchen appliances, but at least it would make sense. At least it would be normal. But sitting there in that interrogation room, watching Clara's face as those officers reacted to whatever nightmare fuel was packed in that suitcase, I realized that infidelity would have been a walk in the park compared to whatever she'd actually been up to. Cheating was amateur hour. This was professional-level deception that required planning, coordination, and apparently some seriously questionable life choices. The woman sitting across from me, the one who still insisted on using the good china when we had people over and who cried during those Sarah McLachlan ASPCA commercials, had somehow gotten herself mixed up in something that made federal agents go pale. That wasn't the kind of thing that just happened by accident. You don't accidentally stumble into whatever category of criminal activity makes law enforcement officers start mentally calculating their overtime hours. This was the kind of situation that required research, connections, and a level of commitment that honestly would have been impressive if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying. Clara had apparently been living a double life with the skill of someone who'd been trained by professionals, and I'd been completely oblivious to all of it. Looking back, there had been other signs too, little things that I'd dismissed or rationalized away because that's what you do when you love someone. The way she'd started dressing differently, more carefully, like she was going to job interviews instead of running errands. The sudden interest in our finances, asking detailed questions about our bank accounts and investments that she'd never cared about before. The new gym membership at a place across town when there was a perfectly good 5 minutes from our house. And then there were the lies. Not big, dramatic lies, but small, everyday ones that didn't make sense until you started adding them up. She was at her book club, except her book club friend posted on Facebook about being out of town. She was shopping with her mom, except her mom called the house looking for her. She was working late, except her office building was dark when I drove by on my way to grab dinner. Each lie by itself was meaningless, easy to explain away or forget about. But together, they painted a picture of someone who was very deliberately creating a false narrative about how she spent her time and where she went and who she talked to. The scariest part wasn't that she was lying. The scariest part was how good she was at it. You know what they say about curiosity and cats? Well, turns out I was about to become the poster child for that particular piece of wisdom. Because after weeks of watching Clara act shadier than a politician during election season, I decided to embrace my inner Nancy Drew and do some good old-fashioned detective work. And by detective work, I mean sitting in our darkened living room at 2 in the morning, pretending to watch reruns of SportsCenter while actually going through her phone like some kind of suburban spy. Now, before you judge me for violating the sacred trust of marriage, let me paint you a picture of my mental state at this point. I'd been living with a woman who'd suddenly developed more security protocols than the NSA, who cleared her browser history with the dedication of someone destroying evidence, and who took mysterious phone calls that sounded like she was coordinating black ops missions. A reasonable person might conclude that some light reconnaissance was not only justified but practically mandatory. The opportunity presented itself on a Tuesday night when Clara made the amateur mistake of falling asleep on the couch after what she claimed was an exhausting day of grocery shopping and errands. Her phone was sitting right there on the coffee table, practically begging to be investigated. She'd been clutching that thing like it contained the nuclear launch codes for weeks, so seeing it unattended was like finding a unicorn in your backyard. I waited about 20 minutes to make sure she was properly unconscious. You know, That deep sleep where someone could probably operate a jackhammer next to your head and you wouldn't budge. Clara was doing that little snoring thing she always denied doing, so I figured it was safe to conduct my amateur investigation. Her phone was locked, naturally. But here's the thing about being married to someone for 10 years. You pick up their habits whether you mean to or not. I'd watched her unlock that thing 1,000 times, and muscle memory is a beautiful thing. 3 attempts later, I was in. Holy crap, was I in. The first thing that hit me was the sheer volume of messages from one particular contact. And not just regular, hey, how's your day messages either. We're talking about the kind of message frequency you'd expect from someone coordinating a military invasion or planning to overthrow a small government. Hundreds of texts at all hours of the day and night, going back weeks. The contact was saved under a name that should have been my first red flag. VR. Not Victor or Vincent or any normal human name. Just VR. Which, in my experience, usually means someone is either really into virtual reality gaming or trying to keep their identity on the down low. Given Clara's recent behavior, I was betting on the latter. I started scrolling through their conversation history, and let me tell you, it was like reading the script for a really bad crime thriller. These weren't love letters or even normal affair-type messages. This was business talk, cold and professional, full of coded language that made my blood pressure spike higher than a NASA rocket launch. Package ready for Tuesday delivery. Confirmation received. Standard protocols. Location change. Use backup route. Payment transferred. No complications. This wasn't pillow talk, folks. This was straight-up criminal coordination, the kind of stuff that makes you realize your suburban life has somehow intersected with the plot of a Jason Bourne movie. But it got worse. Oh boy, did it get worse. Through some truly impressive late-night stalking, research, I managed to piece together who VR actually was. A reverse image search on his profile picture led me down a rabbit hole that ended with me staring at the mugshot of one Victor Russo, a charming fellow whose criminal resume read like a greatest hits album of bad life choices. This guy had more red flags than a communist parade. His rap sheet included drug trafficking, weapons charges, fraud, identity theft, and something called conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, which sounds way more sophisticated than it probably was. His LinkedIn profile, because apparently even criminals network these days, listed his occupation as independent contractor, which I'm pretty sure is mob speak for, I do illegal stuff for money. And the face tattoos. Sweet Jesus, the face tattoos. This wasn't some tasteful little ankle butterfly or meaningful quote on his wrist. No, Victor had gone full commitment with his ink, covering his neck and creeping up onto his cheeks like some kind of criminal vine. The kind of tattoos that make TSA agents reach for their walkie-talkies and mothers pull their children closer at the grocery store. But here's the real kicker about old Victor. According to his social media presence, he was the kind of guy who thought Axe body spray was a legitimate substitute for having an actual personality. His Instagram was a masterpiece of toxic masculinity, full of shirtless gym selfies, pictures of expensive cars that probably weren't his, and motivational quotes about grinding and staying loyal that had clearly been copy-pasted from other people's posts. This was Clara's mysterious contact. This walking advertisement for poor life decisions was the person my wife had been whispering to on those late-night phone calls, the reason for all the password protection and browser history deletion. My sweet, suburban wife, who still used a physical address book and asked me to program the universal remote, had somehow gotten herself tangled up with a career criminal who looked like he'd stepped out of a what not to do with your life handbook. As I sat there in our living room, scrolling through months of correspondence between my wife and this human red flag, a terrible realization started creeping into my brain like ice water through my veins. This wasn't just an affair. This was something much more serious, much more dangerous, and much more likely to end with one or both of us in handcuffs. Clara wasn't just cheating on me. She was planning something with Victor Russo, something that involved packages and payments and backup routes. Something that required the kind of operational security typically reserved for people who don't want law enforcement knowing about their business activities. And sitting there in that airport interrogation room, watching her smirk as she threw me under the bus, I finally understood the full scope of her plan. She wasn't just trying to leave me for some tattooed bad boy. She was trying to ship me off to federal prison as her exit strategy. a neat little buy-one-get-one deal that would give her a fresh start, while making sure I was too busy dealing with my own legal problems to cause any trouble for her new life. So there I was, sitting in my living room at 3 in the morning, staring at my wife's phone like it had just revealed the meaning of life, the universe, and why hot dogs come in packages of 10, but buns come in packages of 8. The reality of what Clara was planning had hit me harder than a meteorite made of pure betrayal, and I had about as much time to process it as a goldfish has memory. Here's the thing about discovering your wife is trying to frame you for federal crimes. It really puts things in perspective. Suddenly, all those little marital complaints seem pretty trivial. Who cares if she leaves dirty dishes in the sink when she's apparently planning to leave you in handcuffs? The toilet seat being left up becomes a non-issue when you realize she's been setting up your permanent relocation to a facility where bathroom privacy is a luxury you can't afford. But here's where the comedy gods, and maybe a few angels with a twisted sense of humor, decided to throw me the kind of bone that usually only shows up in movies where the good guy wins because the bad guy makes one crucial mistake. Because it turns out, 10 years of marriage to Clara had taught me a few things about her methods, her habits, and most importantly, her blind spots. See, Clara was smart. Really smart. The kind of smart that could convince a room full of tax auditors that math was actually just a social construct. But she was also arrogant, and arrogance makes people sloppy. She'd gotten so caught up in orchestrating her elaborate escape plan that she'd forgotten one very important detail. I knew her better than she knew herself. Which is how I came up with what I now fondly refer to as the military husband special. A maneuver so brilliantly simple that it would have made my old drill sergeant weep with pride. You see, Clara had this thing about luggage. She was obsessively particular about her suitcases, the way some people are about their cars or their coffee. She'd spent weeks picking out matching black suitcases for this trip, researching brands, and reading reviews like she was buying space shuttle components. She wanted them to be identical, same model, same size, same color, even the same stupid little wheels that always managed to get stuck on carpet. The suitcases were practically twins, which made sense for a couple trying to look like they were just going on a romantic getaway. But Clara, in all her criminal mastermind glory, had made one tiny oversight. She assumed I was too trusting, too naive, or too plain stupid to figure out what was really going on. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. The bags were sitting in our bedroom, packed and ready to go, looking as innocent as two pieces of luggage could look. Clara's contained enough contraband to make a DEA agent's career, while mine was packed with the usual vacation stuff: clothes, toiletries, that book I'd been meaning to read for 3 years, and my complete inability to pack efficiently. Both suitcases had the same scratches on the corners, battle scars from our previous travels when Clara insisted on packing like we were relocating to Mars permanently. There was that ding on the left side from when she'd overstuffed it with souvenirs from our trip to Vegas, and the scratch on the top from the time she tried to fit our entire medicine cabinet into what should have been just a weekend bag. Even the zippers were identical. That same stupid design flaw where they'd jam at the worst possible moment. Usually when you were running late for a flight and questioning every life choice that had led you to that particular moment of frustration. The switch itself was almost anticlimactic. I waited until Clara went to take her marathon pre-travel shower. The woman could spend longer in the bathroom than some people spend in college. And then I executed my plan with the precision of a seasoned covert operative. Step 1. Carefully remove all the contraband from her suitcase, handling everything with the kind of delicate care usually reserved for defusing bombs or wrapping Christmas presents for your mother-in-law. I didn't want to leave any trace evidence that might tip her off to my little modification project. Step 2. Pack all of that highly illegal material into a storage unit that I'd rented under her name earlier that week. Yeah, I'd been planning this counter-operation for days, complete with forged signatures and fake IDs that would make Victor Russo proud. Turns out, when your wife is planning to destroy your life, you develop some previously unknown talents for subterfuge. Step 3. Replace all of her criminal evidence with my own carefully curated collection of documents. And not just any documents. Oh no, I'd put together what could only be described as the FBI starter pack. We're talking about meticulously organized folders containing bank statements that showed unusual financial transactions, printed emails between Clara and her criminal boyfriend, photographs of their meetings that I'd taken during my amateur stalking sessions, and even hard drives containing backed-up copies of all their text conversations. If James Bond and an accountant had gotten together to have a baby, and that baby grew up to become a forensic investigator with obsessive-compulsive disorder, that baby would have been proud of my documentation skills. I had evidence organized by date, cross-referenced by topic, and labeled with the kind of attention to detail that would make a librarian weep with joy. But the piece de resistance? I'd included a GPS tracker in the bag. Not just any tracker, but a high-end military-grade device that I'd borrowed from my old Army buddy who worked in private security. This little beauty could track location, monitor movement patterns, and send real-time updates to my phone. So now, instead of Clara's bag containing enough evidence to send me away for the next decade, it contained enough evidence to send her away for the next century. And the best part? She had no idea. None whatsoever. The woman who'd been planning my downfall with the enthusiasm of someone planning a surprise birthday party was about to become the star of her own very special episode of How Not to Commit Federal Crimes. As I sealed up the suitcase and made sure everything looked exactly the same as before, I couldn't help but smile. Clara thought she was so clever, so far ahead of the game. But it turns out, sometimes the best defense against a complicated plan is an even more complicated counterplan. Game on, sweetheart. And there we were, back in that delightful little interrogation room that had all the ambience of a morgue crossed with a DMV office, watching four grown men stare into that suitcase like they'd just discovered the lost city of Atlantis was actually located in our luggage compartment. The silence stretched on longer than a line at Starbucks on Monday morning, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in everyone's heads as they tried to process what they were seeing. Sergeant O'Donnell was the first to recover from his apparent stroke, slowly lifting his eyes from the contents of the bag to look at me with the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who'd just been told that gravity was actually optional. His mustache twitched slightly, which I was beginning to recognize as his version of a full-blown emotional breakdown. "Documents," he said slowly, like he was trying to convince himself that the word meant what he thought it meant. "These are documents." I nodded with the kind of serene calm that usually only comes from either deep meditation or having absolutely nothing left to lose. "That's right, officer. Documents. You know, papers with words on them. Revolutionary stuff, really." The other three officers were still staring into that suitcase like it might suddenly transform into something more exciting, or at least something that would justify the amount of paperwork they were probably going to have to fill out. One of them, a younger guy who looked like he'd graduated from the police academy about 15 minutes ago, actually reached out and poked one of the folders like he was checking to see if it was real. "What kind of documents?" O'Donnell asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wasn't going to be vacation photos and restaurant reviews. This was my moment. The big reveal. The scene where the underdog hero pulls out his secret weapon and watches the bad guys realize they've been playing checkers while he's been playing three-dimensional chess. I reached into my jacket pocket with the dramatic flair of a magician about to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Except instead of a rabbit, I was about to produce evidence that would make these officers' day significantly more complicated. "Evidence," I said simply, pulling out a sealed envelope that had more official stamps and watermarks than a government treaty. "Evidence of fraud, attempted smuggling, conspiracy, and probably a few other charges that'll keep your legal department busy for the next 6 months." The envelope was my masterpiece, my Mona Lisa of documentation. I'd spent hours putting it together, making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. Because when you're about to torpedo your wife's criminal enterprise, you want to make sure you do it with style and attention to detail. Inside that envelope were photographs that would make a private investigator proud, shots of Clara meeting with Victor at various locations around town, all time-stamped and geotagged like I was running my own surveillance operation. There were bank transfer records showing money moving in patterns that would make an accountant break out in hives. Text message printouts with timestamps that told a story better than any crime novel ever written. But the real knockout punch: Clara's fingerprints, lifted from various items using techniques I'd learned from YouTube videos and possibly questionable late-night internet searches. Turns out, when you're married to someone for 10 years, you have plenty of opportunities to collect fingerprint evidence without them noticing. Coffee cups, wine glasses, that fancy hand lotion she was always using. All of it became part of my amateur forensics collection. O'Donnell took the envelope with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling religious artifacts or explosive devices. As he opened it and started examining the contents, his eyebrows began a slow journey toward his hairline, rising higher with each piece of evidence he uncovered. "Holy," he started, then caught himself and glanced around the room like he'd almost cursed in church. "This is comprehensive. I like to be thorough," I replied, trying to keep the smugness out of my voice and failing spectacularly. 10 years of marriage will teach you to pay attention to details. Meanwhile, Clara's face was going through more changes than a traffic light, having a nervous breakdown. That confident smirk she'd been wearing like a designer accessory was melting faster than ice cream on hot asphalt. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that her complexion had shifted from glowing newlywed to person who just realized they left the stove on at home. Her knuckles had gone white from gripping the edge of the table, and I could see her brain working overtime, trying to figure out how her foolproof plan had suddenly become a plan that was, well, full of holes. Big, gaping holes that were letting in all sorts of uncomfortable truths and federal charges. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice cracking like a teenager going through puberty. Gone was the cold confidence she'd displayed just minutes earlier. In its place was something that sounded suspiciously like panic mixed with the dawning realization that she might have seriously underestimated her opponent. I leaned closer to her, close enough that I could see the little flecks of mascara that had started to smudge under her eyes, and whispered back with all the warmth of an Arctic winter, "Being better at this whole marriage thing than you thought I was, sweetheart." The beauty of it all was watching her realize that every move she'd made, every secret meeting, every whispered phone call, every carefully planned step in her elaborate scheme to frame me and disappear with her criminal boyfriend, all of it had been documented, cataloged, and gift-wrapped for law enforcement with a big shiny bow on top. She'd been so focused on setting me up for failure that she'd completely missed the fact that I was setting her up for a spectacular fall. While she was busy playing criminal mastermind, I'd been playing the long game, collecting evidence and building a case that would make a prosecutor's career. One of the officers muttered something that sounded like, "This looks airtight," and I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying, "That's what she said," because even in my moment of triumph, I figured maybe I should maintain some dignity while they decided who was going to be wearing handcuffs as a fashion accessory. The tables had turned so completely that I was getting dizzy just thinking about it. If you've never had the pleasure of watching someone's entire world collapse in real time while sitting in a fluorescent-lit interrogation room that smells like disinfectant and broken dreams, let me tell you, it's quite the experience. It's like watching a controlled demolition, except the building is your wife's criminal enterprise, and the explosives are made of her own stupidity and overconfidence. Sergeant O'Donnell had been flipping through my evidence folder with the focused intensity of someone reading the instructions for defusing a bomb, occasionally making little and sounds that suggested he was finding my documentation skills impressively thorough. The other officers were huddled around him like they were looking at baseball cards, except instead of rookie stats, they were reviewing bank transfers and surveillance photos. That's when O'Donnell looked up from the folder and delivered the line that would forever be etched in my memory as the moment Clara's brain officially short-circuited. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying that special blend of authority and barely contained excitement that cops get when they realize they're about to make someone's day significantly worse. "We're going to need to see your passport." Now, I've been married to Clara for 10 years. Which means I've seen her handle everything from surprise tax audits to her mother's unannounced visits with the kind of grace and composure that would make a diplomat proud. I've watched her talk her way out of speeding tickets, negotiate with contractors who were trying to overcharge us for bathroom renovations, and even convince a restaurant manager to comp our entire meal after finding a hair in her salad that definitely wasn't hers. The woman had nerves of steel and a poker face that could have made her a fortune in Vegas. But watching Clara fumble for her passport was like watching a professional ice skater suddenly forget how gravity works. It was a masterclass in how quickly confidence can transform into pure, unadulterated panic when the universe decides to call your bluff. Her hands, which just minutes before had been steady enough to deliver that devastating "it's his" with surgical precision, were now shaking like she'd been mainlining espresso for the past 6 hours. She reached for her purse with the kind of jerky, uncertain movements you see in people who are trying to pet a dog they're not sure is friendly. My passport, she stammered, her voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy trying to ask someone to prom. The confident woman who'd thrown me under the bus with such dramatic flair had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on planet Earth, including possibly Mars or the bottom of the ocean. Yes, ma'am, your passport, O'Donnell repeated, and I swear there was just a hint of amusement in his voice, like he was enjoying watching this little drama unfold. Standard procedure when we're dealing with situations like this. Clara's purse, usually organized with the precision of a Swiss watch factory, had apparently transformed into a black hole of chaos. She was digging through it like she was searching for buried treasure, except instead of gold coins, she was looking for a small blue booklet that would either save her ass or completely torpedo what was left of her criminal master plan. Her knuckles had gone so white they looked like they'd been dipped in bleach. I could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to figure out how to handle this particular request. Because here's the thing about passports, they're not just travel documents. They're official government identification that comes with all sorts of interesting security features and tracking capabilities that make them very difficult to fake or manipulate. And Clara, despite all her careful planning and criminal coordination with her tattooed boyfriend, had apparently overlooked one tiny detail. When you're involved in international smuggling operations and conspiracy charges, law enforcement tends to take a very keen interest in your travel documents. She started, then stopped, then started again, sounding like a broken record player trying to find its groove. Her usual verbal dexterity had apparently abandoned her faster than rats leaving a sinking ship. The silence in that room stretched out longer than a CVS receipt, and I found myself genuinely curious about what was going through her head at that moment. Was she trying to figure out if her passport had any incriminating evidence on it? Was she wondering if Victor's fake document operation extended to official government identification? Or was she just now realizing that her brilliant escape plan might have a few more holes in it than she'd originally calculated? Meanwhile, I sat there watching this whole performance with the kind of detached fascination you'd have while watching a nature documentary about predators who suddenly find themselves being hunted. It was almost educational, really. I was learning things about my wife that 10 years of marriage had never taught me, like how she handled pressure when the stakes were higher than who forgot to take out the garbage or whose turn it was to deal with the in-laws. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering if he should offer to help her look through her purse or if that would somehow compromise the investigation. The poor guy looked like he'd rather be directing traffic or breaking up bar fights than watching a suburban housewife have what appeared to be a complete psychological meltdown over a simple document request. "Take your time," O'Donnell said, though his tone suggested that while he was willing to be patient, his patience had definite limits, and they were approaching those limits faster than a speeding ticket. Clara's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper when she finally spoke again. What if? What if there's a problem with it? And there it was, the question that revealed everything. Because innocent people don't ask, what if there's a problem, when asked for their passport. Innocent people just hand over their passport and maybe complain about how unflattering their photo is or how they always look like they're about to sneeze in official documents. Guilty people? Guilty people ask about problems. You know how in movies, when they separate suspects for questioning, there's always that dramatic moment where they look back at each other through the doorway with meaningful glances and unspoken promises? Yeah, that's not what happened here. When those officers decided it was time to divide and conquer, Clara and I exchanged looks that had all the warmth and affection of two strangers fighting over the last parking spot at Walmart on Black Friday. They led me to what I can only assume was the good cop room. If you can call any room in an airport security facility good. It was basically the same soul-crushing white box as before, except this one had a slightly more comfortable chair and a motivational poster about teamwork that looked like it had been hanging there since the Clinton administration. The poster featured a bunch of rowers in perfect synchronization, which felt like a cosmic joke considering my marriage had just revealed itself to be more like two people rowing in completely opposite directions while the boat sank. I settled into that chair with the kind of zen calm that probably would have impressed a Buddhist monk. Hands folded neatly in my lap, posture straight but relaxed, The picture of a man who had absolutely nothing to hide and possibly everything to gain from this little interrogation session. If there had been a mirror in that room, I probably would have looked like someone waiting for a job interview where I already knew I was getting the position. Meanwhile, from the room next door, I could hear Clara's voice beginning what would become the most spectacular vocal performance of her entire life. And by spectacular, I mean spectacularly awful. We're talking about a one-woman show that started in the key of confident denial and rapidly descended through desperate bargaining before landing somewhere in the territory of unhinged infomercial host trying to sell ice to Eskimos. At first, she was still trying to maintain some semblance of the composed, sophisticated woman she'd pretended to be for the past few months. Her voice carried that particular brand of indignation that wives perfect when they're explaining to store managers why they deserve a refund for something they clearly broke themselves. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake," I heard her saying through the surprisingly thin walls. "My husband is obviously confused about something." Classic Clara move. When in doubt, blame the husband. It's like the first rule in the marriage survival handbook. Right after, always have a good explanation for why you're late, and never admit you ate the last piece of pizza. But as the minutes ticked by, and presumably as the officers started showing her the evidence I'd so thoughtfully compiled, her tone began to shift. The confident indignation started developing cracks, like a perfectly applied makeup job melting under stage lights. Her voice got higher, more strained, with that particular quality that suggested she was beginning to realize that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to become a house of cards in a hurricane. "That's not. I don't know what that is," she was saying, her voice climbing toward frequencies that probably had dogs barking in 3 neighboring states. "Someone must have. This is obviously planted evidence." The planted evidence defense. A classic choice for people who've watched too many legal dramas and think that screaming about conspiracy theories will somehow make physical evidence disappear. I had to give her credit for reaching for the greatest hits of criminal defense strategies, even if she was deploying them with all the subtlety of a car alarm going off at 3 a.m. The progression from there was like watching someone fall down a very long flight of stairs in slow motion. Each stage of her verbal meltdown was more entertaining than the last. A gradual descent from suburban sophistication to full-scale desperation that would have been tragic if it wasn't so richly deserved. Stage 1 was the crying. Not the elegant, single tear rolling down the cheek kind of crying you see in movies, but the full-blown, mascara-destroying, nose-running kind of crying that makes people uncomfortable at funerals. I could hear her sobbing through the wall like she'd just been told that coffee was being permanently banned from the planet. "Please," she was wailing. "You have to understand, I'm just a housewife. I don't know anything about any of this." The housewife defense. Bold choice, considering the officers were presumably looking at bank records showing her coordinating financial transactions with a known criminal. But hey, when you're drowning, you grab onto whatever floats by, even if it's a concrete life preserver. Stage 2 was the begging. This is where things got really interesting, because Clara had apparently decided that if tears didn't work, maybe groveling would do the trick. Her voice took on that particular quality that people get when they're trying to convince a traffic cop not to write them a ticket, except amplified by about 1,000%. "I have information," she was practically shouting. "I can tell you things. About other people. About bigger crimes." Classic criminal behavior 101. When caught red-handed, immediately offer to throw everyone else under the bus in hopes of saving your own skin. It's like the adult version of "I'm telling mom." Except mom is the federal government, and they're significantly less likely to be impressed by your tattling abilities. Stage 3 was the bargaining, which honestly was the most entertaining part of this whole disaster. Clara had apparently decided that this was all just one big misunderstanding that could be resolved through negotiation, like she was trying to return something to a department store without a receipt. "What if I cooperated?" she was saying, her voice taking on that wheeling-dealing quality that people use when they're trying to talk car salesmen down on price. "What if I helped you catch the real criminals? I could wear a wire. I could be an informant." The desperation was so thick you could have cut it with a knife and served it at a dinner party themed around bad life choices. She was throwing out offers like she was running a clearance sale on her own dignity, marked down from suburban respectability to federal informant, with absolutely no returns accepted. And through all of this magnificent collapse, I sat in my chair next door, hands still folded, listening to my wife's criminal empire crumble like a cookie made of pure karma. It was better than any podcast I'd ever subscribed to. Eventually, the symphony of desperation from the next room died down to what sounded like the occasional sniffle and the kind of defeated mumbling you hear from people who've just realized their lottery ticket was off by one number. That's when they brought Clara back into our little reunion chamber. And let me tell you, the transformation was more dramatic than anything you'd see on one of those home makeover shows. Gone was the polished, confident woman who'd walked into this airport looking like she was heading to a spa weekend with her loving husband. In her place was someone who looked like she'd been put through a blender set to emotional destruction and then left out in the rain for good measure. Her perfectly applied makeup had relocated itself to various parts of her face in ways that would have made an abstract artist weep with joy. Her hair, which had started the day looking like she'd just stepped out of a salon, now looked like she'd been wrestling with a tornado and lost. But it was her eyes that really told the story. They had that particular glazed-over quality that you see in people who've just been told that everything they thought they knew about reality was actually a lie. And also, by the way, they're probably going to prison. It's the look of someone whose brain has just blue-screened harder than a Windows 95 computer trying to run modern software. When she sat down across from me, her movements had all the grace and coordination of a drunk person trying to parallel park. Her hands were shaking so badly that she looked like she was operating a jackhammer instead of just trying to pull her chair closer to the table. The confident woman who'd thrown me under the bus with such theatrical flair had been replaced by someone who looked like she couldn't successfully throw a paper airplane, let alone execute a complex criminal conspiracy. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her mouth opening and closing like a fish that had suddenly found itself in a desert instead of water. I could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process how her foolproof plan had turned into a fool's disaster. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band that was about to snap, filled with all the unspoken accusations and realizations that were bouncing around in her skull like pinballs in a machine that was tilting badly. Finally, she managed to croak out two words that carried more venom than a cobra with anger management issues. Tell them. Just two words, but delivered with the kind of desperate fury that suggested she was still operating under the delusion that I was somehow going to save her from the consequences of her own spectacularly bad decisions. Like I was going to stand up, snap my fingers, and make all this evidence disappear through the power of marital loyalty or something equally ridiculous. I leaned forward in my chair, getting close enough to see the little flecks of mascara that had migrated to places mascara was never meant to go, and delivered my response with all the warmth and compassion of an Arctic winter during a blizzard. I already did, I said quietly, each word falling into the space between us like stones into a deep well. Weeks ago, and that's when I watched Clara's brain finally complete its journey from criminal mastermind to error 404, intelligence not found. The silence that followed my revelation could have won awards. We're talking about the kind of silence that makes you wonder if sound itself has decided to take a vacation. It was so complete, so absolute, that I half expected to hear a pin drop just to confirm that the universe hadn't accidentally muted itself. Her face went through more changes than a traffic light, having a nervous breakdown. First came the confusion, as she tried to process what I'd just told her. Her eyebrows scrunched together like they were trying to solve a math problem that involved calculus and possibly some theoretical physics. Then came the dawning realization, spreading across her features like spilled coffee on a white shirt, slow at first, then all at once, leaving a stain that wasn't coming out. I could literally watch her brain working overtime, running calculations and connecting dots that she probably wished would stay unconnected. The pieces were falling into place with all the subtlety of a demolition crew taking down a condemned building. Every secret meeting she'd had with Victor, every mysterious phone call, every carefully planned step in her elaborate scheme to frame me and disappear, all of it had been documented, cataloged, and delivered to law enforcement with a nice neat bow on top. Her mouth opened again, but this time no sound came out. She looked like she was trying to speak underwater, or maybe in a vacuum where words just couldn't exist. The confident criminal who'd been orchestrating this whole elaborate setup had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd just been told that gravity was actually optional, and she'd been falling this whole time without realizing it. But the best part, the absolute cherry on top of this disaster Sunday, was watching her realize the true genius of her situation. Because it wasn't just that her plan had failed. It wasn't even that she'd been caught red-handed with enough evidence to make a prosecutor's career. No. The real beautiful irony was that she'd trapped herself using her own methods. Her real bag, the one packed with enough contraband to stock a small illegal pharmacy, was sitting in an airport locker under her name, with her fingerprints, her ID, and probably her DNA all over it. Meanwhile, the bag she'd thought would destroy my life was squeaky clean except for one tiny detail. It was packed with evidence of her own crimes. The trap she'd set for me had flipped like a pancake on a hot griddle, and she was the one about to get served. Every move she'd made to frame me had actually been building a case against herself. It was like watching someone dig their own grave while thinking they were planting a garden. She searched my face desperately, looking for some crack in my plan, some loophole she could exploit, some way to turn this situation back in her favor. But the joke was on her. I'd sealed every exit tighter than a Tupperware container, and there wasn't a single way out of this mess that didn't involve her explaining to federal agents why she'd been coordinating criminal activities with a guy who looked like he'd been rejected from a reality show about people who make terrible life choices for money. The final act of this whole beautiful disaster played out with all the dramatic timing of a perfectly choreographed dance number, except instead of jazz hands and synchronized kicks, we had handcuffs and federal charges. Watching Clara get escorted out of that interrogation room was like watching the finale of a reality show where the person you've been rooting against finally gets voted off the island, except the island was freedom and the voting was done by the Department of Justice. They didn't cuff her immediately. Apparently, there's some kind of protocol about making sure all the paperwork is properly filed before you start accessorizing suspects with matching metal bracelets. But the writing was on the wall in letters so big you could probably see them from space. Clara walked out of that room flanked by officers like she was some kind of VIP, except instead of heading to a red carpet event, she was heading toward a future that involved orange jumpsuits and conversations with public defenders. The look she gave me over her shoulder as they led her away was pure concentrated poison. If looks could kill, I would have been a small pile of ash with a satisfied expression. It was the kind of glare that could have melted steel, launched nuclear missiles, or convinced a jury that I was guilty of something just based on the sheer intensity of her hatred. But you know what? After weeks of living with someone who'd been planning to destroy my life while pretending to love me, a little righteous anger felt like a refreshing change of pace. I sat in that chair for another 20 minutes, answering questions and signing documents that basically confirmed what everyone already knew. I was the good guy in this particular crime drama, and my wife was the villain who'd gotten a little too clever for her own good. Sergeant O'Donnell actually shook my hand when it was all over, like I'd just helped him solve the case of the century instead of just being married to someone with seriously questionable judgment and a criminal boyfriend who looked like he'd been designed by a committee of people who'd never seen an actual human being. Hell of a thing, he said, his mustache twitching in what I was learning to recognize as his version of amusement. 10 years of marriage, and she thought she could pull this over on you. Guess she forgot that I pay attention to details. I replied, probably sounding way more cool and collected than I felt. Because honestly, walking out of that room as a free man while my wife got processed like a criminal was surreal enough to make me question whether I was actually awake or if this was all some kind of stress-induced fever dream. But it was real. All of it. The evidence, the arrests, the beautiful cosmic justice of watching someone's elaborate revenge scheme backfire so spectacularly that it could have been a case study in how not to commit federal crimes. I walked out of that airport alone, and let me tell you, the air outside tasted different. It had that clean, fresh quality that you only notice when you've been breathing the recycled atmosphere of lies and deception for months without realizing it. Other travelers were dragging their suitcases past me, hurrying to catch flights or meet loved ones, completely oblivious to the fact that somewhere inside that building, Clara was probably sitting in another white room, trying to explain to people who'd heard every excuse in the book why she thought framing her husband for federal crimes was a reasonable response to marital dissatisfaction. The irony wasn't lost on me that all these people were rushing around with their vacation plans and business trips, while I was standing there savoring the simple pleasure of not being arrested. It's funny how your perspective on life changes when you've just narrowly avoided spending the next decade explaining to a cellmate named Rocco why you're in for conspiracy charges you didn't actually commit. I walked over to the taxi stand with the kind of leisurely pace you can only appreciate when you're not fleeing from law enforcement. The driver was one of those chatty types who probably had opinions about everything from the weather to foreign policy, but he took one look at my face and decided that maybe silence was the better part of valor. Smart man. As we pulled away from the airport, I watched the building shrink in the rearview mirror like a bad memory, finally fading into the distance. Somewhere inside those walls, Clara was discovering that real life doesn't work like the movies, where the charming criminal always manages to talk their way out of trouble with a combination of wit and sexual appeal. In real life, when you get caught with enough evidence to stock a police evidence locker, your charm offensive better include a really good lawyer and possibly a time machine. I leaned back in that cracked vinyl seat and closed my eyes, letting myself finally process everything that had happened. My wife, the woman I'd shared a bed with, split mortgage payments with, argued about whose turn it was to take out the garbage with, had tried to pack my entire life into a suitcase full of criminal evidence, and ship me off to federal prison like I was some kind of unwanted Christmas present being returned to the store. But here's the beautiful part. I'd packed that suitcase with her sins instead. The whole thing was like a magic trick, except instead of making a rabbit disappear, I'd made my wife's freedom vanish using nothing but her own criminal conspiracy and a healthy dose of what goes around, comes around. She'd spent weeks, maybe months, planning every detail of how to destroy my life and start fresh with her tattooed Romeo. Every secret meeting, every whispered phone call, every carefully orchestrated step had been designed to leave me holding the bag while she rode off into the sunset. Instead, she was the one holding the bag, literally and figuratively, and I was the one riding off into the sunset. Well, technically I was riding off in a taxi that smelled like air freshener and broken dreams, but the principle was the same. As we drove through the city, past all the normal people living their normal lives without having to worry about criminal spouses or federal charges, I couldn't help but smile. Clara had taught me something valuable about marriage. If your wife suddenly starts locking her phone, smiling too much at airport security checkpoints, and coordinating mysterious activities with convicted felons, maybe, just maybe, you shouldn't trust her luggage. Moral of the story learned, lesson absorbed, and freedom thoroughly appreciated.